Berlin, spring 1940. Inside a dimly lit briefing room at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, German intelligence officers gathered around a polished oak table. Maps of Europe covered the walls, marked with the swift advances of the Wehrmacht across Poland, Denmark, and Norway. On the table lay a different kind of document: economic assessments of the United States. An officer lifted the report, scanned the numbers, and allowed himself a thin smile. America, he noted to his colleagues, was a nation of shopkeepers and factory owners grown fat on commerce. They made automobiles and refrigerators, not tanks and fighter planes. Their army ranked 18th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. Their soldiers had never faced true modern warfare. The room filled with the confident murmur of men who had just conquered half a continent in weeks. One officer closed the file and slid it aside. America, they agreed, was no threat to the Third Reich. They had no idea they were reading their own death sentence. The America of the 1930s bore little resemblance to a military power. The Great Depression had devastated the economy, throwing millions out of work and shuttering factories across the industrial heartland. Unemployment reached 25%. Soup lines stretched around city blocks. The military, starved of funding throughout the decade, had become a skeletal force. In 1939, the United States Army numbered just 174,000 men, smaller than the armies of Romania or Belgium. Its equipment was outdated, much of it left over from the Great War. Tanks were scarce, aircraft obsolete. The nation's focus remained inward, consumed by economic survival and a powerful isolationist sentiment that viewed European conflicts as none of America's concern. To the Axis powers, this validated every assumption about democratic decadence. Germany, Japan, and Italy had spent the 1930s building totalitarian war machines, indoctrinating youth in martial values, and celebrating the warrior spirit. Germany's rearmament under Hitler had transformed the Wehrmacht into the most feared fighting force in Europe. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Panzer divisions had rewritten the rules of mobile warfare. Japan's military controlled the government, its soldiers trained in Bushido, the code of the warrior, and its navy was among the finest in the world. Italy, though less formidable, still maintained the posture of an imperial power with colonial ambitions in Africa. America, by contrast, seemed to embody everything these militarist states despised. It was a commercial republic, driven by profit and comfort. Its citizens shopped in department stores, watched Hollywood films, and debated politics in free newspapers. There was no cult of military strength, no glorification of sacrifice for the state. To German and Japanese military planners, Americans appeared soft, a people who had traded warrior virtues for consumer goods. Intelligence reports noted America's industrial capacity, but dismissed its relevance. Factories that made cars could theoretically make tanks, but would a nation of individualists and capitalists ever mobilize with the discipline required for total war? The early years of World War II seemed to confirm Axis superiority. Germany's blitzkrieg across Poland in September 1939 demonstrated a new kind of warfare: fast, brutal, coordinated. Denmark fell in hours, Norway in weeks. France, the great military power that had bled Germany white in the previous war, collapsed in 6 weeks during the spring of 1940. The Wehrmacht paraded through Paris while the world watched in shock. In the Pacific, Japan's war machine rolled through China, seizing vast territories and resources. The Japanese army had been fighting since 1937, hardening its soldiers and refining its tactics. By 1940, the Axis powers controlled much of Europe and Asia. Their officers studied maps and planned further conquests. America remained an ocean away, neutral, irrelevant. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting. President Franklin Roosevelt, watching Europe burn, understood what the isolationists did not, that America's security depended on Britain's survival, and Britain was running out of time. In December 1940, Roosevelt delivered a fireside chat that would change history. He called on America to become the great arsenal of democracy. The phrase was carefully chosen, not an army of democracy. Americans weren't ready for that, but an arsenal, a supplier, a factory. Roosevelt proposed Lend-Lease, a program to provide Britain with weapons, vehicles, and supplies without immediate payment. It was aid disguised as business, designed to slip past isolationist opposition. The program passed Congress in March 1941. American factories, many still struggling with Depression-era underutilization, began retooling. Car plants studied tank designs. Aircraft manufacturers expanded production lines. Shipyards that had built passenger liners began laying keels for cargo vessels. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible to those watching from Berlin and Tokyo. America wasn't at war, it was just selling goods, doing what Americans did best, making money. Axis intelligence noted the activity, but saw no cause for alarm. Lend-Lease might help Britain survive, but it wouldn't change the fundamental balance of power. America remained a nation of civilians playing at war production. Then came December 7, 1941. Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, sinking battleships and killing over 2,400 Americans in 2 hours. The attack was designed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific. It succeeded tactically. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. The Pacific Fleet was temporarily paralyzed. But strategically, it was the greatest miscalculation in military history. Admiral Irisoku Yamamoto, who had studied in America and understood its industrial potential, reportedly said he feared the attack had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Whether he spoke those exact words is uncertain, but the sentiment proved prophetic. America's response was immediate and total. On December 8th, Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States. The European and Pacific Wars, previously separate conflicts, merged into a single global struggle. And America, the nation of soft civilians, began the most remarkable industrial mobilization in human history. Within weeks, the government issued orders that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Automobile production for civilian use was banned entirely. Every car factory in America would now build tanks, aircraft, or military vehicles. Typewriter companies made guns. Lipstick tube manufacturers produced bullet casings. A pinball machine company switched to making armor-piercing shells. The draft was expanded massively, but the real transformation happened in the factories. This was where the war would truly be won or lost. Roosevelt set production goals that stunned even his own military planners. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943. The target seemed absurd. America had produced fewer than 6,000 military aircraft in 1940, but Roosevelt understood something the Axis did not. America's greatest weapon wasn't its small army or its damaged fleet. It was its people and the industrial infrastructure they had built during peacetime. The assembly lines that made Fords and Chevrolets could make Shermans and Hellcats. The shipyards that built ocean liners could build Liberty ships. The workers who had been unemployed for a decade were ready to work again. All they needed was a purpose. And now they had one. The transformation began with people who had never held a wrench. Housewives who had spent the Depression managing tight budgets suddenly found themselves operating hydraulic presses in aircraft plants. Farmers who had worked the land for generations became welders in shipyards. Retirees returned to work, teaching younger workers skills they hadn't used in years. Teenagers lied about their ages to get factory jobs, eager to contribute. The workforce that assembled was unlike anything the world had seen, diverse, inexperienced, motivated by a mix of patriotism and economic necessity. They worked in plants that operated around the clock, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. The iconic image of this transformation was Rosie the Riveter, a cultural symbol of female industrial workers. But she represented a massive reality. Before the war, women made up less than a quarter of the American workforce, and most worked in domestic service or light manufacturing. By 1944, 6 million women worked in factories, many in jobs previously considered unsuitable for them. They operated drill presses, drove forklifts, read blueprints, and assembled complex machinery. At Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, women made up a third of the workforce. They welded hull plates, installed engines, and painted warships. Some had never worked outside the home before Pearl Harbor. The speed of production became America's secret weapon. In shipbuilding, this was most dramatic. Traditional shipbuilding was a slow, careful craft, each vessel custom-built over many months. Liberty ships, the cargo vessels designed to carry war materials across the Atlantic, were different. They were simple, standardized, and built using prefabrication and welding instead of riveting. The first Liberty ship took 244 days to complete. By 1942, Kaiser shipyards had reduced that to 42 days, then to 30. Then, in November 1942, the Robert E. Peary was assembled in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. It was a publicity stunt, but it proved the concept. America wasn't just building ships, it was mass-producing them like automobiles. At the Willow Run plant outside Detroit, Ford Motor Company built B-24 Liberator bombers on an assembly line. The facility was the largest room under one roof in the world, over 3 million square feet. Raw materials entered one end, finished bombers rolled out the other. At peak production in 1944, Willow Run produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. Workers who had assembled Model Ts now assembled 4-engine heavy bombers. The Germans, who built aircraft in small workshops using skilled craftsmen, couldn't comprehend the scale. A Luftwaffe officer who toured the facility after the war stood silent, overwhelmed. "Now I understand why we lost," he finally said. The numbers were staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 296,429 aircraft. Germany, fighting desperately and prioritizing aircraft production above almost everything else, managed 189,307. Japan produced 76,320. Combined, the Axis powers built 266,627 aircraft. America alone outproduced them by more than 30,000 planes. In tanks, the disparity was similar. The United States manufactured 88,410 tanks during the war. Germany built approximately 67,000. The Soviet Union, with massive American material aid, produced over 100,000. But the quality and reliability of American tanks meant fewer breakdowns, easier maintenance, and longer operational life. Then there were the ships. America launched 2,710 Liberty ships alone, simple cargo vessels that could carry 10,000 tons of supplies. But it also built 141 aircraft carriers of various types, 8 battleships, 807 cruisers and destroyers, and 203 submarines. Japan, the world's third-largest naval power in 1941, built 17 aircraft carriers during the entire war. America built more than that in fleet carriers alone, plus dozens of smaller escort carriers. By 1944, the U.S. Navy was larger than all other navies in the world combined. Japanese admirals watched American task forces steam across the Pacific and knew replacement vessels arrived faster than they could sink them. The technological innovation extended beyond mere quantity. American industry applied mass production principles to weapons manufacturing, creating standardized parts that could be easily replaced in the field. A tank damaged in North Africa could be repaired using parts from a depot in England. Aircraft maintenance became faster because components were interchangeable across thousands of planes. This was industrial warfare, not the craftsmanship of European armories, but the ruthless efficiency of Detroit assembly lines applied to instruments of war. German tanks were often superior in armor and firepower, but they were also complex, prone to breakdown, and difficult to repair. American Shermans were simpler, more reliable, and available in overwhelming numbers. Women weren't just participants in this revolution, they were essential to it. In aircraft plants, women made up the majority of assembly workers. They riveted aluminum fuselages, installed electrical systems, and painted insignia on wings. In ammunition factories, women loaded shells and packed explosives, dangerous work that killed hundreds in industrial accidents. At the Douglas aircraft plant in Long Beach, women worked on scaffolds 40 feet above the ground, assembling the wings of C-47 transport planes. Many had children at home, relying on the new phenomenon of workplace daycare centers. They worked 10-hour shifts, then went home to care for families, then returned the next day. The Axis powers watched this unfold with growing alarm. Intelligence reports from German agents in neutral countries described the scale of American production, but the numbers seemed impossible. In 1942, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, received reports that American aircraft production had reached 48,000 planes that year. He dismissed it as Allied propaganda. No nation could build that many aircraft in 12 months. But the reports were accurate, and 1943 would be worse. Japanese naval intelligence tracked American ship launches with increasing desperation. Every carrier they sank was replaced by 2 more. Every transport sent to the bottom was replaced within weeks. The psychological impact on Axis leadership was profound. They had started the war believing in the superiority of their martial cultures, their disciplined soldiers, their warrior spirit. But wars are won not just by courage, but by bullets, shells, tanks, and planes. And in that contest, the soft American civilians were burying 3 empires under an avalanche of steel. German generals on the Eastern Front begged for more tanks, more aircraft, more ammunition. They were told production was at maximum capacity. Meanwhile, American units in Europe complained they had too much. Supply dumps overflowed, equipment sat unused. The disparity wasn't just quantitative, it was existential. The year 1943 marked the turning point where production became victory. In January, Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca to plan the next phase of the war. The production goals set at that conference were almost absurd. 125,000 aircraft for the year, millions of tons of shipping, enough supplies to support simultaneous offensives in Europe and the Pacific. American industrial planners returned home and got to work. By the end of 1943, they had exceeded almost every target. The United States produced 85,898 aircraft that year, falling short of Roosevelt's goal, but still outproducing Germany and Japan combined. On the battlefield, this translated to dominance. At Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, American and Japanese forces fought a brutal 6-month campaign for control of a single airfield. Japanese troops were skilled, determined, and willing to die. But American logistics proved decisive. Ships brought steady streams of reinforcements, ammunition, food, and medicine. Japanese supply convoys were hunted by submarines and aircraft. By February 1943, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal, unable to sustain its forces. The pattern would repeat across the Pacific. Japanese soldiers fought with desperate courage, but they ran out of bullets, while Americans had warehouses full of them. In Europe, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 showcased American logistical might. Operation Husky involved landing 160,000 troops on a hostile shore, supported by thousands of aircraft and hundreds of warships. The invasion fleet included 2,590 vessels, more than the Spanish Armada, the D-Day fleet, and the largest naval battles in history. Eisenhower's planners didn't worry about having enough ships, they worried about coordinating the traffic. German and Italian defenders fought hard, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of firepower. American artillery batteries fired shells faster than German factories could produce them. Fighter bombers circled overhead in shifts, maintaining constant air cover. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany illustrated the industrial imbalance most starkly. The U.S. Army Air Forces and Britain's Royal Air Force pounded German cities and factories around the clock, the British by night, the Americans by day. German fighters rose to meet them and inflicted terrible losses. On a single mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, the Americans lost 60 bombers and 600 men. It was unsustainable, except that it was. Factories in America replaced those 60 bombers in 3 days. New crews trained and shipped overseas within weeks. The Luftwaffe shot down thousands of American aircraft, but the bombers kept coming, an endless stream that never diminished. Meanwhile, German factories operated under constant bombardment. Workers assembled aircraft in underground facilities, hiding from Allied bombs. Supply chains fractured as rail yards burned. By 1944, Germany was producing fewer aircraft than in 1943, despite desperate efforts to increase output. Albert Speer performed miracles keeping production going, dispersing factories, prioritizing fighter production, and simplifying designs. But he was fighting mathematics. Germany's entire industrial capacity, working at maximum output under total war conditions, couldn't match American production running at three-quarter capacity, with much of the economy still producing civilian goods. The psychological moment came in different ways for different leaders. For Speer, it was late 1944, reviewing production reports in his Berlin office. He had the numbers in front of him: German tank production for the month, aircraft output, ammunition stockpiles. Then he looked at intelligence estimates of American production. The ratio was crushing. The United States was outproducing Germany in every category, and the gap was widening. Germany was fighting for survival, mobilizing all resources. America was fighting a two-front war while maintaining the highest standard of living in its history. Speer closed the file. In that moment, he knew Germany had lost the production war, and losing that meant losing everything. Japanese admirals faced their reckoning watching American fleets multiply. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation effectively ceased to exist. American pilots shot down 476 Japanese aircraft in 2 days, while losing 76 of their own. But the losses weren't comparable. Japan had lost most of its trained carrier pilots. Those men had trained for years and couldn't be replaced. American pilots lost too, but new ones arrived constantly, trained in huge programs back home. And the carriers themselves. Japan had lost 3 in the battle. America had dozens more under construction. The crushing mathematics played out everywhere. Monthly tank production. America produced 2,000 Shermans in an average month in 1944. Germany managed about 600 Panthers and Tigers combined. Better tanks individually, but outnumbered more than 3 to 1. Artillery shells. American factories produced so many that forward units sometimes fired artillery barrages just to use up surplus ammunition before moving to the next position. German artillery batteries rationed shells, saving them for critical moments. Trucks. America built 2.4 million military trucks during the war. Germany built 335,000. This meant American units were mobile, flexible, and could be supplied anywhere. German units, even elite panzer divisions, often relied on horses for transport. The moment when mockery turned to terror wasn't a single event, but a creeping realization that spread throughout Axis headquarters throughout 1943 and 1944. German officers who had laughed at American industrial reports in 1940 now read them with dread. Intelligence assessments that once seemed like propaganda were revealed as understated. The soft civilians weren't just matching German production, they were surpassing it by factors that seemed physically impossible.
and they were doing it while keeping their homeland untouched, their cities unburned, their factories operating in safety behind oceans that Axis forces could never cross. Japanese officers faced similar despair. Every plan, every strategy assumed numerical parity or skill through fighting spirit. Bushido taught that the warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantages, but there were limits. A Zero pilot could be braver, more skilled, and more determined than his American opponent, but if the American had 10 times as much fuel, 5 times as many bullets, and a replacement aircraft waiting for him if he was shot down, courage alone wouldn't bridge that gap. By late 1944, Japanese commanders were sending pilots on suicide missions, not because they believed in certain victory, but because it was the only way to inflict damage when conventional tactics were hopeless against such overwhelming material superiority. The numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could hide. From 1941 to 1945, the United States produced more than the Axis powers combined across almost every category of military equipment. Not just slightly more, vastly more. In a war where industrial capacity determined survival, America had won before the first shot was fired. The Axis just didn't know it yet. They assumed that democracies were weak, that civilians couldn't sustain total war, that commercial societies would crumble under military pressure. Instead, they discovered that a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers could outbuild 3 empires when given a reason to fight. The mockery died in the quiet realization that they had underestimated everything that mattered. When the war ended in August 1945, the final production tallies revealed the scale of American industrial dominance. The United States had produced 296,429 aircraft, 86,333 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2.4 million military trucks, 5,777 merchant ships, and 87,620 warships. The cost was $341 billion, approximately $4 trillion in modern dollars. It was the largest economic mobilization in history, transforming America from a Depression-era economy to the most powerful industrial force that the world had ever seen. But beyond the numbers were the human stories, the workers who made it possible, and the enemies who watched in disbelief as their war machines were simply overwhelmed. Germany's production, by comparison, told the story of a nation fighting beyond its means. German factories built 189,307 aircraft and 60,000 tanks while under constant bombardment, with supply lines severed and resources dwindling. It was an impressive achievement given the circumstances.
The human cost of this production miracle was real, but different from combat casualties. Industrial accidents killed thousands. The Hercules Powder Company explosion in 1940 killed 51 workers. The Port Chicago disaster in 1944 killed 320 men loading ammunition. Women working in munitions plants faced constant danger from explosive materials. Factories operated at such intensity that fatigue-related injuries were common. The wartime industrial workforce endured 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, year after year. Communities transformed overnight. Small towns became industrial centers, housing shortages forced families into cramped quarters, and social structures strained under the pressure. Yet workers persevered. War bond rallies raised billions for the war effort. Scrap metal drives collected materials for recycling. Victory gardens supplemented food supplies. Rationing of sugar, meat, and gasoline was accepted with minimal complaint. The sense of shared purpose was genuine. Everyone contributed, and everyone knew their work mattered. A woman riveting bomber fuselages in Burbank wasn't on the front lines, but she knew the aircraft she built would carry bombs to Germany or supplies to soldiers in the Pacific. The connection between factory floor and battlefield was direct and understood. Post-war testimonies from Axis leaders confirmed what the numbers suggested. Albert Speer, interrogated after Germany's surrender, was asked when he knew Germany would lose. "When I saw the production reports from America," he answered, "we were fighting the largest economy in the world with our industries under constant attack. It was mathematics." Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, before his forced suicide in 1944, had told associates that Germany couldn't win a war of attrition against American industry. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, admitted that his submarines sank Allied ships faster than British yards could replace them until American shipyards entered the war. Then the equation reversed catastrophically. Japanese officers expressed similar sentiments. Admiral Osami Nagano, who had advocated for the Pearl Harbor attack, later acknowledged the miscalculation. "The Americans," he said after the war, "can produce steel in quantities that no Asian or European nation can match. We attacked them thinking we could win a short war. We failed to understand they would turn their entire industrial capacity against us." Field Marshal Chuichi Nagumo, who led the Pearl Harbor strike force, watched his carrier fleet dwindle throughout 1942 and 1943 while American carriers multiplied. He died at Saipan in 1944, his forces overwhelmed by an American fleet that seemed to grow with each battle. The legacy of the arsenal of democracy extended far beyond 1945. American factories that had built tanks and bombers now built cars and washing machines using the same mass production techniques. The workforce that had proven itself in wartime carried that competence into peacetime. Women who had operated drill presses and welded ship hulls returned to domestic life in the 1950s, but their daughters remembered. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans to college, creating the most educated workforce in history. American industrial dominance shaped the Cold War. The Soviet Union knew that any conflict with the United States would involve facing the same productive capacity that had crushed Germany and Japan. The transformation also changed how wars were understood. Military theorists studied the campaigns and battles, but economists and industrial planners studied the production figures. Future conflicts would be decided not just by tactics and courage, but by GDP, manufacturing capacity, and resource access. The nuclear age added another dimension, but the fundamental truth remained. Nations that could outproduce their enemies could outlast them. America's victory in World War II was won on beaches and in jungles, in the skies over Europe and on the seas of the Pacific. But it was built in the factories of Detroit and Los Angeles, in the shipyards of California and Virginia, by workers who had been dismissed as soft civilians. The numbers were preserved in archives and museums, production reports, shipping manifests, factory payrolls, but the real legacy was harder to quantify. It was the knowledge that democracy could mobilize as effectively as totalitarianism, that free people working voluntarily towards a common goal could outperform regimented populations under authoritarian control, that consumer capitalism, dismissed as decadent by its enemies, possessed hidden strength in its industrial infrastructure and adaptive capacity. The Axis powers had started the war confident in their military superiority and contemptuous of American softness. They ended it buried under an avalanche of American-made steel, defeated not by a warrior culture, but by workers who had never held a rifle. The war ended with the signing of surrender documents, September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. American officers stood in neat rows on the deck of a battleship built in a Brooklyn Navy yard, crewed by sailors from farms and cities across America, floating in waters thousands of miles from home. The logistical chain that put that ship there stretched back to iron mines in Minnesota, steel mills in Pennsylvania, and factories across the industrial heartland. It was the final expression of the industrial power that had won the war. The irony was complete. Axis officers who had mocked American civilians in 1940 surrendered to those same civilians in 1945. German generals signed capitulation documents surrounded by American equipment that had crossed the Atlantic in numbers they couldn't comprehend. Japanese admirals stood on the deck of a ship that represented a navy larger than all other navies combined, built by a nation they dismissed as incapable of martial discipline. The soft civilians had proven harder than steel. What the Axis failed to understand was the nature of democratic mobilization. Totalitarian states could command obedience and extract sacrifice through force. Democracies had to persuade. But once persuaded, free people brought creativity, initiative, and determination that exceeded any regimented system. American workers didn't build ships because they feared punishment. They built ships because they understood why it mattered. Factory supervisors innovated because they were rewarded for efficiency, not punished for deviation from plans. The decentralized, chaotic American system that looked weak to authoritarian observers proved remarkably resilient and adaptive when challenged. The legacy of the arsenal of democracy lived on in every post-war institution. The United Nations was headquartered in New York, built with American steel. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe using American dollars earned from wartime production. NATO's military strength rested on American industrial capacity. The interstate highway system, built in the 1950s, used techniques developed moving military supplies during the war. The commercial aviation industry grew from military aircraft production. Plastics, electronics, computers, all benefited from wartime research and production experience. America emerged from the war as a superpower, not just militarily, but economically, industrially, and culturally. The silent factories themselves mostly returned to quiet lives. They raised families, bought homes in new suburbs, and watched their children grow up in the prosperity their work had secured. Some kept their wartime identity badges as mementos. Others donated welding helmets and work gloves to museums. Many never spoke much about their contributions, seeing their work as simply what needed to be done. But they had changed history. They had proven that industrial capacity, mobilized and focused, could decide the fate of nations. They had outbuilt 3 empires and demonstrated that the true measure of strength wasn't just courage on the battlefield, but productivity on the factory floor. The silent factories that had roared with activity during the war years eventually fell quiet. The massive plants that built bombers were repurposed or demolished. Willow Run, the mile-long bomber factory, became a storage facility and later an airport. Kaiser shipyards in Richmond closed down, the ways that launched Liberty ships every few days sitting empty. But the memory remained, the memory of what free people could accomplish when challenged, when united by purpose, when working toward a goal they believed in. The soft civilians had become the hardest force the world had ever seen, and in doing so, they had secured not just victory in a war, but the future of the free world. In the end, the Axis learned what America's potential enemies would learn again and again throughout the 20th century. Underestimate American industrial power at your peril. Mock the civilians if you wish. Dismiss the shopkeepers and factory workers. Assume that comfort makes people weak. But remember that those same people, when threatened, can transform their economy into a war machine more powerful than any the world has seen. They can outbuild, outproduce, and outlast any opponent. Not through military tradition or warrior culture, but through something more fundamental, the productive capacity of a free people working together toward survival. The lesson was written in steel and aluminum, in the hulls of ships and the wings of aircraft, in the mountains of supplies that crossed oceans and the rivers of ammunition that fed armies. 3 empires learned it too late. The soft civilians had won, and the world would never be the same.